times of darkness, the sun still shines regardless, and I think that that's a reminder that light will always harness the power to break through fear, dry tears, right here. Our home stays home if we all just stay home and cherish all the memories and dreams left to fulfill. The one message that will reach cashiers at the till, will reach those stocking the shelves, reach those asking for help. We play the cards we've been dealt, but together, I know that we have a fighting chance. Socially distant, but mentally we're holding hands. In this together, whatever endeavor, we will treasure the better times and recognize that we are an important part in each other's lives. As I send this message to men, women, and children, this world is our home, so we should all care for the building. The storm is raging on, but sun shines after a blizzard. I'm a Walmart wizard, an associate with Heart of Magic. Like all my Walmart family, together, we make it happen. We live better together. So together, let's make it happen.
Hola, Papa. I'm calling you to say that I've sent you a little money. I know you'll say that I shouldn't have, but I really want you to be here on my wedding day to dance with me.
Look into the sky.
When you send money, you send more than money. Western Union.
Dr. Christopher, let me just say what an honor and a pleasure it is that you're joining us today at the Welcoming Interactive. I so wish that we were in person together, but really delighted and appreciative that you could be with us here in our Zoom rooms.
Well, I'm honored to be here, and I responded immediately when I received the invitation because it's so important, the work that you're doing and the energy that you're putting into our national discourse that contrasts with xenophobia and all those things that divide us. So I'm very happy to be here. Thank you, Rachel, for inviting me.
Thank you. That really means so much at this difficult time when I know many of us are really struggling to find that way through. And I'll say that this invitation really came from a moment that I'm sure many of us have had in our lives where we just read something that was so powerful, it just cracked something open. And that moment for me was really reading your testimony to the Helsinki Commission. And there's a number of different pieces of that I really want to explore in this conversation. But one of them that really struck me was you talked about building the individual and collective capacity to see ourselves in the face of the other. And I wondered if you could just talk about what you meant by that.
You know, I was really inspired by a quote from Albert Einstein, where he talks about that as the work that we all have to do. He expands on it and talks about our needing to understand our relationship and our interdependence with all of nature, but certainly with our fellow human beings. And in essence, that's the real work. That's the visionary place of replacing this false idea of a hierarchy of human value that enables us to objectify and to distance from people. It drives fear and it drives all manner of horrific behaviors. But, you know, focusing on that and eliminating it is the goal. But, you know, you got to have something that you're working toward. And this core value of being able to have a sense of connection with an extended communal relationship with humanity, with the perceived so-called others, that's really the work that we have to do in this country, particularly because we were built on this ethos of a false hierarchy of human value.
Built on this ethos, can you dig into that history a little bit for us and just unpack that a bit? I think a lot of folks that work on immigration don't always get the chance to step back and really think about that, and would love to just hear more.
You know, and there are some very forward-thinking and forward-working lawyers in the immigration space that really do understand our country's history of discrimination and prejudice and oppression of diverse people, the indigenous people, And then, of course, the enslavement of African Americans for consecutive centuries, right? And once the Civil War was fought to end slavery, we still didn't replace that deep-seated belief that justified it, that some people are essentially better or have more innate value and worth, more humanity than others. And so we have struggled with that as a country to try to bring about fairness and equity and human rights and civil rights, but we really haven't done the work of transforming our culture. The ethos refers to the spirit of a thing, the spirit of a culture, and the spirit of America, as is evidenced in all of our systems of power and authority and economic inequality. The spirit of America is very much still rooted in that antiquated idea of a hierarchy of human value, which, as Heather McGhee writes in her recent book, gets translated into many different iterations, one of which is this zero-sum mentality, which is if the perceived other gets ahead, then somehow that diminishes my ability to get ahead or takes away. And so this notion of a zero-sum or lack, this protective nature of what is mine and you can't have it, it all grows out of this fallacy of a hierarchy of human value, which we can't survive, I think, as a viable democracy unless we do the work of transforming that consciousness, that ethos.
Mm. So powerful to just be able to step back and talk about belief systems, not programs, not policies, but really the thing from which all of that stems. And I'm just so, it's just so powerful, this idea that we even can do that. What enables us to do that in the first place, to be able to pull back some of the layers and really get to that deeper understanding?
Well, the framework for truth, racial healing, and transformation, or is commonly referred to as TRHT, which is an effort that I designed that is our attempt to apply the principles of truth-telling, to our old democracy, as it were. The framework suggests ways to do that, or how do we do that? And I think the core piece is our collective narrative, and our individual narrative, our stories. We know now with the advances in neuroscience, we know that it's through our stories that we shape our beliefs and our perceptions. And there were many stories that reinforce that fallacy of a hierarchy of human value. So a big part of the shift and the how of the shifting is grounded in creating narratives that really do emphasize and lead us into this deep awareness of our common humanity. It can be done through, our media avenues and streams, but it can also be done through our interactions with one another. But those personal stories that reflect our common humanity, that's one way that we see the absurdity of adhering to the fallacy of a hierarchy of human value. And then interpersonal relationships, cross-racial relationships, the literature is very clear that the best way to reduce bias is through connection and interaction with diverse people. Then we, of course, have to deal with the systems of inequity that have been structured based on this belief. And those, we asked ourselves in creating the TRHT strategy and framework, we asked ourselves, well, how has this fallacy been entrenched for so long? And three primary answers surfaced. One is through separation, through forced isolation. Everything from detention in immigration facilities, separation from parents and families, residential segregation, isolation in housing. I mean, the list goes on, but clearly the tools of separation help to maintain our belief in a hierarchy of human value. And those tools keep us from moving beyond that. Our legal system, as has been evidenced by so much police brutality that's been caught on videotape, but our legal system has many ways of reinforcing. Our immigration laws have historically reinforced the fallacy and embodied the fallacy of a hierarchy of human value through preferential, rules for certain groups. It's amazing how we've translated this idea of a hierarchy into our immigration system and our immigration laws. And then ultimately, it's all about the economy. These systems of human exploitation and discrimination and oppression, they're really designed to fuel economic gain for some at the expense of others. So those are the 5 components of the TRHT framework, which I think is the answer to the how we do this, through narrative change, through racial healing and relationship transformation, relationship building, and then undoing the entrenched systemic avenues of sustained separation, really transforming our legal system to acknowledge the errors of its design and its roots, and then ultimately transforming our economy that is one that is deliberately and intentional designed to promote equity, living wages, opportunity for all.
It's both powerful and also maybe a little overwhelming to think about all of these different streams where work is really powerfully needed. And so I think a question that I wrestle with every day is, how do we organize ourselves to really tackle this at the scale that it requires, with the collective will that it requires? And I'm interested in how you're thinking about that.
Yeah, that is the real challenge, right? I had the privilege, as you know, of serving as a senior executive and leader of a major foundation, which had, at its disposal hundreds of millions, indeed billions of dollars to put into the field to help support the community-based efforts. And I think that that's a big part of how we do it. We have to make sure that the community-based efforts, the organizational efforts, are resourced well enough to be successful. I mean, if you look back at American history, it's always been the grassroots, as they say, or the community leaders who are experiencing the pain from the unfair systems, who organized to change those systems, whether it was labor unions, or people fighting for voting rights. Part of what we have to do, though, is make sure that they are resourced and as importantly, that they are networked so that they can amplify each other's efforts. And that's what I was privileged to be able to be a part of at the foundation. It was a reflection of decades of work in that space. And so I think that those are 2 of the important answers to that question. People will not sit still for oppression. People have always, throughout history, stood up. And we are in a democracy and we are in a well-resourced, economically stable democracy. So we can afford to resource that capacity, if you will, for fighting for change. And I think our philanthropic sector, even our public sector, has to be tweaked and nuanced to be able to do more of that more effectively.
We're talking about the US context, but I'm thinking back to Isabel Wilkerson was a speaker at our conference some years back, and she talked about the act of migration as that resistance, as part of what a human being does to say this, enough is enough, and we're seeing that all over the world, and we'll continue seeing more of that all over the world. And so this isn't just an American issue, this is really a global issue, and that is also something you talked about in your testimony. Can you just say a little bit more about that, and what do we see when we zoom out to look at the world as a whole?
And that testimony was part of a panel that was pulled together by one of our allies and advocates in the TRHT work, Misha Thompson, who is a director of the Helsinki Commission work. And she brought in people from around the world who were actually describing, their local efforts in European countries. And I would really encourage people to visit the Helsinki Commission website and see some of those other testimonies. So that's one thing. I would say that there is an expanding movement globally that is called transitional justice. And it applies primarily to emerging democracies that are coming out of authoritarian and horrific, governments that have created all sorts of oppressions and brutal treatment of people. And then the victims and the oppressors come together into truth efforts which are tied to some sort of compensation or reparation and commitment not to repeat, the harms. The challenge there is, however, America's had 4 centuries to embed this, right? So, we're not an emerging democracy. We may be fragile right now, given the level of political division, but we have to design an approach that allows us to look back far enough and with enough momentum to actually transform systems of inequality that are very deeply entrenched. So as we studied many of the truth and reconciliation efforts that had happened in more than 40 countries around the world, we realized that most of those were part of that transitional justice movement. And we had to learn from them, but we also had to adapt, to our unique circumstances. And the other thing about America is we're so diverse. We're essentially a country of people coming into this country, either voluntarily as refugees or as enslaved Africans, or where the land was acquired from the original people of Mexico. So we have a lot of diversity here. We have a lot of tensions around that diversity. And so we have to have an approach to healing and figuring out a transcendent sort of focus, if you will. Now we have it in our Constitution aspirationally. We talk about people being created equal and being endowed by their creator with the inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But even when that was written, the reference point was white males only, white male property owners, so it's been a tension and an evolution to make that aspirational frame applicable to all people. And that's just real work that we have to do. And I think if we do it, it enhances our leadership position globally, because there's an emerging retrenchment right now from democracy and from the values of all people being treated equally.
Which is unfortunate, because we know that, there is both this moral imperative of equality, human rights, but also there's this economic imperative of what kinds of innovation and economic growth and opportunity can come when we really harness that diversity. It seems like the greatest missed opportunity in front of all of us right now.
When you couple that with the climate challenges and our need to restructure our relationship with the planet itself, right? Much of this migration is being driven by climate, change and climate crisis. We have to come together to save ourselves and our home, our planet. So there's so many imperatives right now that would demand that we find our way to each other, that we find a way to recognize, honor our interdependence and our relationship as an extended human family. It's urgent. And that's one reason why I'm so happy to be having this conversation with you. We don't really have a choice but to welcome, because there may be a time when many of us may need to be welcomed. That's one of the reasons, but because it's part of our planetary responsibility, I believe.
Wow. Well, and I hope that we can all start from this premise that this is existential and we have to figure it out. And now I'm putting myself in the shoes of somebody who is one of these local leaders who is, trying to do right by their community and thinking, what are my next steps? I'm maybe already doing some work that is about creating a more inclusive community, but what do I need to embrace, and maybe what do I need to shed in order to really do what's right in this moment?
I've lived long enough to be willing to be bold. And at this stage in my career, I'm convinced that this work is a spiritual work, that it is a work that begins with self-reflection, self-direction, that leads to inner guidance in terms of the ability to know what to do and when to do it. So I think that that's an important part of being a good leader in this work, is being self-reflective and listening deeply to your inner wisdom that guides you. In terms of building a critical mass of public will for the work, that's basic community organizing, but it's also what I call racial healing, which is an intentional effort to bring diverse people together, creating safe spaces, compassionate spaces, where people can interact with the quote perceived other because you invite them to do that. And we live in such segregated spaces, and our lives are so complicated right now, particularly because of COVID-19, that we can go for decades and never really interact with diverse people. So I think a really important tool for this change is implementing strategies that will bring diverse people together, not to discuss issues, not to judge one another, but to hear each other's stories so that we're building this connective tissue, this idea that there is a commonality across our differences. And I think that that's laying the groundwork for civil conversations and for expanding the circles of engagement and reducing the fear that is driving our divisions.
I see this tension every day. We started off talking about individual and collective capacity, and there's sort of this strand around what is needed at a very individual level to create this form of compassion, of empathy. And then there are these deep structural challenges. And I just see that the zero-sum narratives that you talked about earlier often play out around these two sets of problem solving. So, it's insufficient just to deal with this interpersonal work. It is insufficient to do the structural change without laying this groundwork. How do we help people see that this is part of one whole and that these things are not moving against one another? Or maybe sometimes they are moving against one another, and how do we deal with that?
Well, I love your question. I really do. And, my training in the health sciences is as a holistic health practitioner. So my bias in terms of my cognitive model is holistic. It is integrative. And so when we created the truth, racial healing, and transformation framework and approach, we were trying to say, you have to do both. Now, you may not have to do both at the same time, but our approach to transformation has to understand that it is, in a democracy anyway, it's individuals, it's empowered individuals, it's voters, it's people who run organizations, who teach our children, who deliver our healthcare. It's individuals. And so you can't negate the primacy of the individual while you're working on the systems change. There's something about the mindset of the colonizer and Western mindset that just loves a dichotomy, right? It's either or, it's this or that. And truthfully, it usually isn't either or this or that. Usually it's both and. And so there's this movement now, particularly in philanthropy, which is called decolonizing, right? Or trying to change the way of knowing and the way of thinking. But this has been true for my entire career. We don't really have the luxury of these false dichotomies. We kind of have to keep an open mind, and we have to recognize that it can be both and, it may not be both and simultaneously, but it's probably both and that's what we tried to capture in the framework, because that tension that you described has very much been a part of the journey toward racial equity and transformation. You've actually had camps where people said, no, you do it this way, you work for systems change. Doesn't matter what people believe, it doesn't matter what's going on in terms of relationships, but that I believe reflects a level of inexperience with how systems change, and perhaps more importantly, how that change is sustained over time.
You talked about keeping an open mind, and I'm curious, what are the practices that you use to keep your mind open?
That's a good question. Well, my grandson, who's about 2 years old, just keeps my mind, my heart, my eyes, everything wide open and filled with joy. So that is a very, very powerful gift that comes later in life. I guess if you're lucky, you get to be a grandparent. I am very much a proponent of nature and time in nature as a healing force. We do know that being in nature in a forested area or near water actually does lower stress levels and reduce cortisol levels. So one of my practices that I'm privileged to have is the ability to walk and be with trees and nature and flowers in a garden just about every day, more than once a day. That's an important practice. The other practice for me is a form of prayer that is not isolated, but is constant in terms of being reminded of my relationship with what we call all that there is, or the divine, and making myself remember that, throughout the day. And I find that doing so calms my inner self. I know that this is actually a neurological thing that's happening and a physiological thing that's happening. But definitely the practice of humility in the presence of a greater power is helpful to me in terms of maintaining balance, but also maintaining hope. I know that, we're growing up as a human species. This is our evolution. And, we just have to keep working at it.
Hmm. Well, what gives you hope in this moment? What does give you hope in this moment?
Well, the election outcome in 2020 gave me a great deal of hope. And there really is a movement in this country toward overcoming racism and striving for racial equity. There's never been a president that included this commitment in his inaugural address, which this president did. There's never been a government-wide assessment and retooling for the purposes of driving equity and fairness. So I've had many iterations of my career, one of which was at the Institute for Government Innovation at Harvard University. And I'm seeing many of the things that we saw seeded, 20, 25 years ago, we see them now taking hold and happening in the public sector. Many of the people we funded when I was in philanthropy, have matured in terms of as a movement, as movers and shakers for change. So there's some advantages, I think, to growing older, and doesn't appear to be physical, but there's a certain advantage that comes from being able to look back and see a lot of success. It keeps you hopeful, and it makes you know that it is possible to bring about change. Now, we can't be naive and not be prepared for backlash. And I think sometimes, we think, oh, we accomplished this policy goal and it's done. Well, no, it isn't. In a democracy, it's never done. And that's why this softer work, this work of maintaining this critical mass of support, of expanding the circles of engagement, of transforming the consciousness so that we do truly develop a new ethos, a new set of values the set of values is grounded in an appreciation for one another and for our humanity. That's a long answer to your question, but that's what gives me hope.
Well, I think just, thinking about that consciousness and who can be part of creating it is what gives me hope, because it's something that anybody can be a part of, anyone can engage with. It's not a matter of title or job description. And I'm really interested in who those doers are, obviously how we mobilize them, but just curious, who have you seen in those seeds that you've helped to plant and that have now grown, that really reflect the diversity of different kinds of people that can be involved in this work?
Yeah, well, one of the groups that I just think the world of is the Color of Change. And I remember when the idea was put forth by Rashad that there could be an online civil rights organization, right? And at the time, many of the sort of mainstream civil rights and human rights organizations didn't take him seriously. But now, 10 years later or more, he's probably the most effective civil rights organization out there. Now, that might get me in trouble saying that, but as the society shifted to an online society, and culture, he was ahead of the game in terms of understanding that could happen. But then there are campus centers all across America, Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation campus centers, where the next generation is being prepared to not be caught up in a narrative of racial hierarchy, to develop the skills and the tools for building relationships across racial lines. I live in the DC area, and George Mason University is one of the places where this work is happening. And so there are, I think this year there might be as many as 64 college campuses engaged in this work. We also have places that are working in partnership with philanthropy all across the country. There are at least 14 different local jurisdictions that are using this framework for TRHT and applying this work. And they know that the spirit of the work is a spirit of engagement. And I don't use the word inclusion as readily because it implies the hierarchy. It's sort of like I get to choose to include you. I try to focus on expansion and thinking of a circle and all of us as equal. Nonetheless, these organizations, they know that this is about all of us. The TRHT community responded immediately to the recent horrific hate crimes against Asian Americans because Asian Americans are part of this expanding community. And they were able to stand up for one another because they felt the pain, of one another. And so this work is happening. It is happening. The mainstream civil rights organizations are working together. And we really encourage that work at the Kellogg Foundation. We called them anchor institutions at the time, but they are mobilizing together for equity. Even the recent congressional action to foster reparations, is supported by multiple groups. People understand the historic nature of anti-Black hatred and sentiments and how that has opened the door for oppression for all diverse groups. So I'm really excited by what I see happening around the country and what I'm fortunately still in a position to help encourage and to resource from my role as executive director of the National Collaborative for Health Equity.
Well, I am encouraged by it too. And I think about our members, who are in 41 states and, working on these issues and also, doing it obviously in the context and within the history of their own communities and, with, varying levels of support and engagement around TRHT. And so when I think about an event like Welcoming Week, which is a moment for communities to really affirm this value and the role that TRHT could play, in that and really taking a step back to look at what healing means in the context of that community, I think it's really powerful and something that I hope our members will engage with.
I love the concept of healing as it relates to the immigrant community, from a holistic perspective, because when people ask me, what do I mean by healing? I really refer to, wholeness, right? Wholeness of individuals, wholeness of community, and ultimately wholeness of our nation. And so I am very happy again to be engaging with and inviting the immigration advocates into this space, because I think it is a synergy.
Well, speaking of healing, I wanted to ask you about health and how we define health in this moment. And can you help us maybe think ahead to how we as a society are defining health and how these issues fit into it?
Well, health is so much more than the absence of disease. It's taken us a long time, as a Western medical society, so to speak, to understand that health is not just about, diagnosing and treating pathology, that health is really a state of well-being. And that state of well-being is holistic in nature and multidimensional. It is no accident that those who were more vulnerable to the effects, the ravages of this pandemic, were people who were exposed to the consequences of the belief in racial hierarchy. So we had more exposure to the virus, but in many cases there were compromised immune systems, so the resistance to it was reduced, and then there was limited access to the care that was needed in a timely way. Everything from, the housing crisis, the affordable housing crisis, the epidemic of evictions, the crowded workspaces, the crowded living spaces, the lack of availability of appropriate transportation. I mean, we have structured a society that doesn't take into account really, from a policy perspective, those conditions that are needed for creating health and sustaining health. And that's the opportunity that this rebuilding after the pandemic presents. We can unpack all of those streams, those social determinants that are required for well-being. And I think we really do have to, health and healthcare are part of the well-being paradigm, but it's really the social environment, the ethos, that allows the innate capacity for self-healing and restoration to be optimal. Everything from access to quality food, affordable quality food. Oh, what's been exposed in terms of food insecurity and exacerbated, by this pandemic. It makes you shudder to see people standing in lines to get access to food. So there's a lot for us to restructure and redesign to promote health and well-being in a holistic sense. And I'm hoping this is a moment in which, we really do step into that challenge.
Well, I hope we do. And I see the risks of not stepping into it. I mean, obviously lives lost, but also in the work of immigration, we've seen so many times, throughout the history of our own country's immigration laws, how disease and narratives around disease have been used to further otherize people, not only immigrants. And so, I worry in this moment where we start to, hear those narratives reforming, reshaping, what we can do to get ahead of that and make sure that we are immunizing ourselves from those dangerous narratives.
It's interesting that you use the term immunize, because the disparities in access to or willingness to access immunization are racial disparities right now. So I think you're absolutely right in terms of the need to not allow the data around inequities and exposure and morbidity and mortality, to not allow that to further divide, right? And that's why we have to redouble our efforts to promote what I consider the core skills and capacities of racial healing. And those are empathy, self-compassion that then promotes compassion for others, and then perspective taking. The ability to listen and to genuinely engage, to hear the perspective of others. Those are just basic skills like reading, writing, and arithmetic. We need those skills in our society if we're not going to fall into the traps of being manipulated into deeper division for individual and political gain. So we need to do this work, and we need to make it a priority, a national priority. And that's part of the healing work. It's also part of the narrative. We have to change our expectations. And now, when social media is driving so much of our media generally, or our exposure to media, I think the social media world has to be brought to the table to be held accountable for helping. If we can use social media to divide a country, I think social media can be used to unite this country. And we need to ask social media leaders to be part of this effort.
I'm certain that they can play a powerful role, and I hope that they will. I hope that everyone in our society will play a role in really affirming that this is the most important priority of our generation, of our time. And I'm so grateful for all you do to help us, think about that with greater clarity. I want to end just by asking you what brings you into this work? We didn't get really to your to your story, and I don't know if the editing gods will shine upon us and allow time for it in in the conversation. But is there a moment in your life that you look back on, or moments? I'm sure there are many of them that really set you on this course, or just drove you to do the work that you do.
Well, I will, quite honestly, my center that I developed here in Maryland for healing in nature, it's called the Intianu Center for Healing in Nature. And Intianu was the name of my firstborn child who died in infancy. And the name means noble spirit. So she was only with us for 3 months, and it exposed me to what is still a virulent health inequity for women of color. We call it infant mortality. We realize that maternal mortality is also a parallel challenge. Too many mothers die in childbirth. But it was that experience that set me on a journey to try to learn, why was this happening? What was this phenomenon, this grave health inequity, which then we call disparities. And that really led, my career unfolded in response to that quest. I think of my daughter who left as a spirit that came to do that, to set me on my course in life. And that's why I wanted to honor her memory by creating this center to do that. But that was really what compelled me to begin the work. And then once I became aware of the inequities and the disparities, that compelled me to stay in the work and to be as creative and try to be as effective as I could. And I've just been blessed that work has been recognized and acknowledged throughout my life.
What a tragic moment. And as a mother, I just, it's hard to even hear that story, but also so beautiful to just be touched by your experience and turning that tragedy into so much good work. And what a beautiful way to honor a life.
Well, and I was blessed, I must say, to have 2 wonderful children after that first loss. And they are now adults and very creative and powerful people in their own right. And so I feel like my life has been blessed, and I'm just very thankful.
Well, thank you for sharing that blessing with all of us.